about addressing science challenges with adversarial neural networks. And this is work of a lot of people, but in particular, I've picked out Mustafa, Michaela, and Adrian, who are the kind of lead authors of the work I'll be presenting. And they've all overlapped at some point or another with our group in LBL. Okay, so first of all, I'll introduce briefly deep learning, which is obviously a hot area, and I won't be able to do it justice in a brief introduction, but I'll try. And then the area of particularly generative adversarial networks. And then most of the talk will be some applications to science, covering 3 areas as an example of what you can do in this area. And then I'll cover some challenges and directions for the future. Is the audio okay? Or, yeah. Okay. Okay. So first of all, I'm from NERSC, which for those who don't know is the sort of production mission high performance computing center for the Department of Energy. So we have a huge variety of science users across different domains: cosmology, climate, genomics, particle physics, etc. And our big machine, which was the hot topic last year, at least, is Cori XC40, around 30 petaflops peak. And most of this is composed of 9,000 KNL nodes. We also have a Haswell partition. Okay, but then as well as sort of traditional high-performance computing, we also have a data analytics group, which I'm in. And this provides lots of data services, but also in the area of machine learning, we provide tools. We optimize these to run at large scales on machines like Cori. And we encourage cutting-edge methods, and in some cases, collaborate directly with science partners to further projects using cutting-edge methods. So this kind of is a take on an industry version of a machine learning for science plot, and it kind of is this website. It illustrates many projects that we know of that are going on Cori and have been involved in, and you can look on the website for more details of lots of those. And I'll be particularly talking about this sort of area of unsupervised learning and generation. Okay, so deep learning. So in general, deep learning just really means neural networks with multiple hidden layers. So that gives you something that's highly nonlinear and has like many weights, like millions of weights potentially, and so a huge capacity for modeling complex things. And so the ability to do this has been enabled by improvements in computing, as we know, and also the existence of sort of tractable neural net architectures, so clever ways of sharing weights like convolutional neural networks that make sense for the structure of the data, but mean that you can also still have a huge capacity. So obviously there's been lots of industry and academic interest, and so huge improvements in, for example, image processing. So this guy on a motorcycle you can separate out with segmentation. Oops. But also software frameworks such as TensorFlow and Keras and PyTorch that make it very easy to develop these models. And so we obviously track hardware quite a lot in NERSC since we're an HPC center, and we see increasingly the hardware is focused towards this kind of workload. So this is the Volta GPU, which is in the now cool supercomputer, I guess. And then Google's TPU, and this is Intel Nirvana Lake Crest that was interestingly debuted at NIPS last year rather than a supercomputing conference. So I think that shows the change of focus. But what I'm interested in is leveraging all this work for science. And so there's various ways that this can be done and various benefits that we can see. So the first is just improving sensitivity of the existing analyses. But then there's even more interesting things you can do, which is moving to high dimensional data. So this is a collision at the Large Hadron Collider, and you can see, well, you probably can't see, but there's like hundreds of millions of channels in the Large Hadron Collider. And what you normally do is reconstruct a few variables for analysis, but starting to use this method, you can start to move towards increasingly raw data and exploiting all the information that's there. Another area is model agnostic discovery, where you can just kind of cluster using unsupervised methods all of this data and start to see patterns that you maybe wouldn't have put in the first place. And again, what I'll be covering here is about fast and accurate simulation at high resolution. So just to talk about adversarial neural networks. Now, the word adversarial is used quite a lot, actually, in in the deep learning space. So what this talk might have been about, but isn't, is adversarial examples, which is a huge issue in industry. So for example, someone can like just put a tag on a stop sign and confuse an AI self-driving car. Or the example that I like here, because I like cats maybe, but is that this, you can take cat images and now machines can identify cats better than humans, but a slight modification that seemingly the same cat, but is identified by the machine learning as guacamole, which I find humorous. But I won't be talking about this. Potentially it could have some applications to science in making machine learning models more robust, but there's not much work in that area, and I won't be talking about it. What this talk is about is generative adversarial networks, or so-called GANs, where you train two neural networks against each other in order to generate new examples. And what this talk is a little bit about is adversarial training generally, so used for other purposes other than generating. Okay, so generative adversarial networks. So here, as I mentioned, the idea is to have two neural networks. The first, the generator, takes in a small latent space vector, relatively small, and with noise creates some examples. Now, initially, it has no idea what it's trying to do, so it creates random noise. But then this is fed into a discriminator network that has actually the samples that you're trying to create. So for example, cat images. It sees real cat images and compares to the generated cat images. And because these are optimized together, the discriminator starts off picking easy aspects of cat images to separate them. The generator gets those easy aspects right, and then more and more subtle aspects are generated as you go along. And so for image-like data, you can build these out of convolutional neural networks. And again, you can build on industry research. So this is now, a relatively old paper in the field, even though it's 2 years ago. It was this DC GAN paper, which shows how to, a bunch of hyperparameters that work for, having a generator that generates images. But the problem with this, because you have these two neural networks working in tangent, these can be highly unstable. And there's various reasons for this in the literature. You're searching in a high dimensional space for something that's a low dimensional manifold. It's difficult to optimize because it's a saddle point that you're trying to optimize to. And the end result of that is you can get mode collapse, where you just pick out a few of the features of the underlying structure rather than the whole complexity. But to this, science problems potentially have some advantages. There's an underlying physics structure that you might hope to capture. We have huge existing simulation samples in certain fields, which is good both for training data, but also as a way of comparing whether you've actually achieved success. And most importantly, and related to that, we have metrics to evaluate success. So unlike a cat image where it's just you show it to people and see whether they like it or not, we have quantitative ways of identifying success. Okay, so the first science use case is one from industry, which is generating celebrity faces. So this paper from NVIDIA researchers probably shows the state of the art here, where they can get very realistic, high-resolution images generated from this. And this plot on the right shows something that I'll be illustrating in a science case later, is that you can interpolate between different faces and get a smoothly varying thing between that, which is interesting because it sort of suggests that the networks are not just spitting out the same images or modifications of the initial images back to you, but really have kind of generated spectrum. Okay, but now to come to real science use cases. So, I think I don't have to convince this community maybe simulations are essential to science. They're often computationally expensive and run on big HPC machines. But actually, in some cases also, you have an issue where no good simulation exists, and all you have is real data. So, I'll be covering the area of cosmology, which run, big HPC simulations. This is actually a particle physics simulation, and this is urban systems. Okay, so cosmology first. Okay, so cosmology, you only have one universe, so in order to try and understand more about it, you want to create virtual universes with different cosmologies and compare how that looks to the real universe that we live in. These are computationally expensive, like this hack sim took 2 weeks on a resource the size of Cori. And one product of these is these weak lensing convergence maps that are 2D images that can then be compared to observable data. So this project seeks to augment the simulations with a learned generative neural net. So the idea is that you would feed it existing simulations, train it on that, and then be able to produce these in a fraction of the time, and potentially interpolate to different cosmologies, and so to get an understanding of what it looks like without having to run these huge expensive cosmology simulations. And we found here that you could use a DC GAN type architecture, as I showed earlier, on these fairly large images, sort of out of the box with a little bit of work. So does it work? So this shows the training with epoch, and it starts off random. And then as the training goes on, you see more and more of the structure that you expect to see. So, looks like it's working. And here, there's a comparison of the validation at the top, which is, a separate data set of validation images and the generated images. And by eye, you can't really tell the difference, so it seems to have got the structure. And if you make a basic histogram of the intensity, you see that for the validation in black and the generative images in red, they sit on top of each other, so it's got a lot of that structure. But more interesting is to compare the summary statistics, which is what cosmologists actually look at to understand these simulations and real data. There's the power spectrum, which is like the 2-point correlation, but a Fourier transform of that. And here you can see that quantity plotted, and the validations in black and the GANs in red and pink. And you see not only does it get the mean right, but it also gets the whole variation of the structure right. So it has all of the kind of statistical variation that the validation set has. And you can take slices here and compare the agreement, and you see it has a very high p-value. And the interesting thing is here, GANs were not explicitly trained to reproduce these distributions. It just sort of gets it right. And the same is true of these higher order Minkowski functionals that are like the 3-point correlation. So it's not just reproducing Gaussian structures, but higher order structures too. Okay, so this is showing the kind of interpolation equivalent. So this is the equivalent of morphing between celebrity faces, but for the cosmology faces, and you can see, again, it's smoothly varying. So it really, it's not just parroting back the training set. Okay, so moving to particle physics now. In particle physics, you're interested in collisions at things like the Large Hadron Collider, which occur in big, building-sized detectors like this is the Atlas detector here. Now, in order to be able to interpret any observations in terms of new physics, or even to separate it out from existing known physics, you need to have huge samples of simulated data. And the simulated data also needs to simulate the interaction of particles with the detector, and that can lead to these huge microphysics simulations. So this is a particle coming into the calorimeter, and they aim to model all of its interactions. So this is called a shower in the calorimeter, and there are existing faster simulation approaches where, for example, you just take a template, but they're not precise enough for many of the applications here. So this project, CosmoGAN, led by Michaela, who was an intern with NERSC, but also these are physicists in the Berkeley lab as well. What they did was to model a sort of 3-layer, 3-image kind of structure, which actually represents similar to what the Atlas detector is. And they also used a custom sort of neural net design to exploit the fact that there's, highly location-dependent features. So they invented this thing they call the LAGAN. And the other interesting feature here is they also tried to condition this by giving it the particle energy and training it to be able to extrapolate in that. So again, they see realistic, average, and individual images. But as I mentioned here, they are actually able to extrapolate in the energy parameter. And this just shows that if you put in an energy, you get out a simulation of that energy. And the other thing is it's fast. So you can generate 5 million particle showers per minute on a GPU without really any attempt to optimize this, just running it as it is. While the full simulation, you can only generate 30 showers per minute on a CPU. So this is really game-changing in terms of speed. Okay, so my last example, which is from a very different science, is about urban systems. So this is work of Adrian, who's now actually in our group in NERSC, but used to work at MIT when he did this work. So here, you don't really have a simulation sample, so what they use is this CityNet data set that's a collection of data about real cities. And it's a collection of maps, so image-like data on population, building density, and nighttime luminosity, and vector data that kind of masks out water areas and you know, what is the city in terms of its boundary. And so again, they found they were able to apply a DC GAN type architecture directly to this data. And so if you sort of visualize real cities using this kind of triangle of colors, population, building, and luminosity, this is what real cities look like in a data set. And this is what synthetic cities look like. So again, by eye, it seems to get a lot of structure there. And that's interesting. Okay, but then, you know, actually in this field, it's not clear that you do have a metric for comparison. So a lot of their paper actually is showing how you can construct a metric of radial distances, and I have a backup slide on that, but I won't go into it in detail. But what I wanted to show is how you can use the interpolating thing in this field for sort of interesting results. So, you know, they took this West African city, Bamako, and sort of thought about how could you consider interpolating between Bamako and another city like Kumasi, and see, okay, how might it evolve between those two states? And so you can take the building population and luminosity of Bamako and evolve it to Kumasi, and it gives you a kind of idea of how cities evolve. Okay, so in the end, I just wanted to cover a few future opportunities and challenges. So I think I've kind of shown here that GANs can reproduce science features. And this is including, you know, a lot of the subtlety, including the non-Gaussian structures and these kind of higher order calculations, and derived variables. So all of the things of physics interest in the particle physics case, you know, are fairly well modeled, and in some cases with very high accuracy. So what I was showing for the cosmology case, you know, it's a level of precision that's way above other sort of emulating methods. And it's extremely fast. So, you know, we're talking 8 orders of magnitude faster or something like that. So, you know, there's many ways you can use this. So, for example, interpolating. So this is what we're trying to do on the cosmology project, is really get to the point where you can put in cosmology constants. And instead of running a full simulation for it, you run this extremely fast simulation and you get an idea of what it would look like. But you can also start to think about, so we save out, you know, petabytes of data of scientific simulations, which are then, you know, perhaps merged into a later data analytics process. And you could instead now consider actually generating this on the fly and just saving the very compact model instead of the huge amounts of data. And as I was also indicating in the urban system case, you can now start to think about generating simulated data sets where you don't really have a good model. And this actually also applies to particle physics and cosmology. There's parts of it where you don't have a good model, and you want to be able to still have a sort of realistic simulation. But there are challenges. So, you know, of interest to this community perhaps is that you've sort of moved the computational challenge now to the training side of things. And there's actually significant compute required for the training, because you've got these 2 neural networks, and it takes hours to train these things, or even longer. And actually moving to distributed training, I mean, that's difficult anyway for deep neural networks distributed training on HPC resources, but particularly in this case of these generative adversarial networks, you know, the need to like re-optimize hyperparameters when running at different scales is very painful, we found. But then there's methodological issues underlying here. So as I said, there's issues in stability and convergence. In some cases, even though I said it is precise in some cases it's really not good enough to replace existing fast simulation or full simulation approaches. And then there's sort of fundamental questions about whether it learns a target distribution and can generalize. You know, it's not doing magic, so I don't think you can say that it's going to replace the full simulation, but to what extent can you trust it to interpolate or extrapolate? And how to do that interpolation in science parameters. Instead of just varying the latent space and ending up with nice looking things in between, how do you actually create meaningful things in between? So this is, I think, impactful and important area of research, but, don't throw out your HPC simulation just yet. So I just wanted to mention one brief thing, actually, if we've got time, is that, my title was just generally adversarial networks, not generative adversarial networks, and I talked entirely about generative ones, but the applications, really, of these techniques are not limited to generation. So, for example, one issue we face in using deep learning for science applications, just for classification, for example, is you hit these kind of objections where it says, okay, your deep neural network did very well, but that's because it focused on some mismodeled aspect that in your simulations, for example, that we don't understand well, and there's some systematic errors on that we can't evaluate. So, that's why we use our physics variables, because we understand those well. And then so another related but slightly different objection is that, oh, that's because your deep neural network picked up on this variable, but we actually don't want something that's correlated with that variable because we're going to use that later in the analysis. So one solution to this can be to use adversarial networks to so-called pivot. So the theory for this, so this isn't something that I'm personally involved in, but I do think it's interesting. The theory for this was in this paper. And the idea is that you feed it these variables into an adversary that explicitly tries to push what's learned away from that variable so that what you end up with is uncorrelated with that. So this is an application in the particle physics domain. And here's a variable that they're interested not to be correlated with, the jet invariant mass. And this shows the neural network output normally is very highly correlated with this in the red. But if you apply this kind of technique, you can get something completely uncorrelated in the black. Okay, so I'll just sort of conclude. Adversarial networks offer ways to apply deep learning to tackle science problems, beyond the simple, way of just improving classification accuracy. So this is a sort of whole new field of applying deep neural networks. It's potentially transformative applications for simulation, and there's other applications too. For example, this decorrelation one, but you could probably think of many more, actually. So, there's a huge promise in simulating science with high fidelity, many orders of magnitude quicker than currently, but as I call it, the word of caution, we're just beginning to explore the applications and to tackle all the sort of methodological and computational challenges.